Political thought before Plato. The great age of Athenian public life fell in the third quarter of the 5th century BC, while the great age of political philosophy came only after the downfall of Athens in her struggle with Sparta. Here, as in so many cases in history, reflection followed achievement, and principles were abstractly stated only after they had long been acted upon. The Athenian of the 5th century was not much given either to the reading or the writing of books, and, moreover, even if political treatises were written before the time of Plato, not much has been preserved. Nevertheless, there are clear indications that much active thought and discussion were expended upon political problems during the 5th century, and also that many of the conceptions found later in Plato and Aristotle had already crystallized. The origin and development of these ideas cannot be properly traced, but the atmosphere of opinion must be suggested in which the more explicit political philosophy of the next century could evolve. Popular political discussion. That the Athenians of the 5th century were immersed in the discussion of politics need scarcely be said. Public concerns and the conduct of public affairs were their great topics of interest. The Athenian lived in an atmosphere of oral discussion and conversation which it is difficult for the modern man to imagine. It is certain that every sort of interesting political question was actively canvassed by the curious and inquiring minds of Athenian citizens. Indeed, the circumstances could hardly have been more favorable to certain sorts of political inquiry. The Greek was almost forced to think of what would now be called comparative government. Throughout the length and breadth of the Greek world, he found a great variety of political institutions, all indeed of the city-state type, but still capable of very great differences. At the very least there was one contrast which every Athenian must have heard discussed from the time he was old enough to follow the conversation at all, that between Athens and Sparta, the types of the progressive and the conservative state, or of the democratic and the aristocratic state. Then in the East, there was always the terrible shadow of Persia, which could never belong out of any Greek's consciousness. He hardly counted it, indeed, as a genuine government, or at all events, he counted it such a government as only the barbarian merited, but it formed the dark background upon which he projected his own better institutions. As his travels took him still farther afield to Egypt, to the western part of the Mediterranean, to Carthage, to the tribes of the Asiatic hinterland, he found continually new material for comparison. That the Greek of the 5th century had formed already a lively curiosity about the queer laws and institutions which filled his world is amply proved by the fund of anthropological lore embodied by Herodotus in his history. The strange customs and manners of foreign peoples form a regular part of his stock in trade. Behavior which in one country is looked upon as expressing the greatest piety and goodness is regarded in another with indifference or perhaps even with loathing. Each man naturally prefers the customs of his own country, and though there may be little in these customs which is intrinsically superior to those of another country, the life of every man must be lived in accord with some standards. Human nature needs the piety that belongs to some sort of observance. Herodotus looked with a curious and a tolerant eye, but withal respectfully, upon the strange medley that he revealed. He considers it the most certain evidence of Cambyses' madness that he despised and insulted the religious rites of other nations besides the Persians. It is, thinks, rightly said in Pindar's poem that uses and won't is lord of all. Even in this very unphilosophical book, there is one rather startling bit of evidence of the lengths to which popular thought in Greece had gone in theorizing about government. This is the passage in which 7 Persians are represented as discussing the relative merits of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Most of the stock arguments appear: the monarch tends to degenerate into a tyrant, while democracy makes all men equal before the law. But democracy readily becomes mob rule, and a government by the best men is certainly preferable. And nothing can be better than the rule of the one best man. This is a genuine Greek touch which Herodotus certainly did not learn in Persia. This standard classification of the forms of governments, then, was a bit of popular theorizing long antedating anything known as political philosophy. When it occurs in Plato and Aristotle, it is already a commonplace that needs not to be taken too seriously. In the beginnings of political thought, no doubt disinterested curiosity about foreign countries counted for something, but this was certainly not the main motive. The essential condition was the rapidity with which the Athenian government itself had changed and the tenseness of the struggles by which the changes had come about. At no date within the historical era had there been a time when Athenian life or indeed Greek life had been mainly regulated by unquestioned custom. Sparta indeed could pose as a marvel of political stability, but the Athenians had the perforce to take pride in progress, since not much could be said for the antiquity of his institutions. The final triumph of democracy was not much older than the political career of Pericles. The constitution itself went back only to the last years of the 6th century, and the beginning of the democracy, counting from the establishment of popular control over the courts by Sophon, was less than a century older. Moreover, from Solon on the general issues of Athenian domestic politics had been the same. The underlying causes were economic, and the issue was between the aristocracy, dominated by the old and well-born families whose property was inland, and democracy, dominated by the interests of foreign trade and aiming to develop Athenian power upon the sea. Already Solon could boast that the purpose of his legislation was to see fair play between the rich and the poor, and this difference of interest was still for Plato the fundamental cause of disharmony in the Greek government. Athenian history, and indeed the history of the Greek cities generally, had been for at least 2 centuries the arena of active party struggle and the scene of rapid constitutional change. Only occasionally is it possible to catch a glimpse that enables one to guess how intense the discussion of political questions must have been that accompanied these struggles. In particular, the triumph of the democracy at Athens was the occasion of at least one astonishing bit of political description which probably did not stand alone, and which serves to show how well the underlying economic causes of the political changes were understood. This is the little essay on the Constitution of Athens, written by some disgruntled aristocrat and formerly attributed, falsely, to Xenophon. The author sees in the Athenian constitution at once a perfect instrument of democracy and a thoroughly perverted form of government. He sees also that the roots of democratic power are in overseas commerce and in the consequent importance of the navy which, under ancient conditions, was the typically democratic branch of the military system, just as the heavy armed infantry was the typically aristocratic branch. Democracy is a device for exploiting the rich and putting money into the pockets of the poor. The popular courts he regards as merely a clever way of distributing pay to the 6,000 jurymen and of compelling Athens as allies to spend their money in Athens, while they wait to get their judicial business transacted. Like Plato later, he complains that in a democracy one cannot even tell a slave when he jostles one in street. It is obvious that Plato's satirical picture of the democratic state, in Book 8 of the Republic, was no new theme. There is other evidence also that the Athenian public was no stranger to the discussion of the most radical programs of social change. Thus Aristophanes in his Ecclesiazussi, which was performed about 390, was able to make a comedy out of the idea of women's rights and the abolition of marriage, which has strongly suggested a relation to communism put forward seriously by Plato at about the same time. Women are to oust men from politics. Marriage is to be discarded, children are to be kept in ignorance of their true parents, and are to be all equally the sons of their elders. Labor is to be performed only by slaves, and gambling, theft, and lawsuits are to be abolished. The relation of all this to the Republic is obscure, since it is not known whether Aristophanes or Plato published first. But this is not a really interesting point. Aristophanes seems to be lampooning not a speculative philosophy, but the utopian ideas of radical democracy. And since the primary requirement of comedy is that it should go over the footlights, his audience must have known what he was talking about. It is an obvious inference that early in the 4th century at least, an Athenian audience found nothing incomprehensible in a thoroughly subversive criticism of their political and social system. Again, Plato was not an innovator, he was merely trying to take the social position of women seriously, a serious question then as now in spite of the harebrained treatment it may receive.